we deal with a country, we want honesty. And I think with the new president, you're going to see much more honesty.
At 7:14 in the morning, federal analysts watching pandemic spending noticed something impossible to ignore. More than $250 million in emergency child meal funds had flowed into a small network of nonprofits in Minnesota. Some sites claimed they fed 5,000 children a day, even though reporters later found no children on site at all. One restaurant listed as a meal center reported serving nearly 1 million meals in a single month. According to the Department of Justice, luxury homes, high-end cars, and international wire transfers appeared almost as fast as the paperwork behind them. The numbers kept climbing. Dozens of defendants across multiple states, hundreds of fake invoices, tens of thousands of non-existent meals. The Associated Press confirmed that investigators traced millions into private accounts, offshore purchases, and properties that had nothing to do with feeding children. Yet through all of this, no gunfire, no street violence, no cartel war, just signatures, spreadsheets, and a system that allowed fraud to grow quietly in the middle of a national emergency. This is where the story begins. A case so large that federal prosecutors called it one of the biggest pandemic fraud operations ever uncovered. A criminal network that used silence instead of force, and paper instead of weapons. And now the question follows us into this investigation. Was this simple fraud, or the blueprint of a new kind of organized crime? Before we go deeper, subscribe to Military Power so you never miss the truth behind the operations hiding in plain sight. The deeper investigators looked into the case, the clearer it became that this network did not behave like any street gang Americans usually imagine. There were no colors, no turf lines, and no armed crews patrolling a neighborhood. Instead, the people behind the fraud built something quieter and far more durable. They designed a structure that blended into ordinary life, one that operated through papers, signatures, and front-facing respectability. According to the Star Tribune, many of the individuals charged ran small businesses, daycares, community centers, or nonprofits that looked perfectly normal on the outside. Nothing about them suggested a criminal machine capable of moving tens of millions of dollars. The key was distribution. No single leader stood in the spotlight, and federal agents found that responsibility was broken into fragments. One group handled paperwork, filing meal claims that later proved to be fraudulent. Another managed the flow of money, routing federal funds through bank accounts and then into purchases that had nothing to do with children or food. Others acted as intermediaries, opening companies that existed only on paper, giving the network more places to hide its activity. Fox 9 Minneapolis reported that several sites listed as meal providers were simply empty rooms or businesses that had never served food. The structure made it difficult to trace accountability because no one individual controlled every stage of the operation. Although they never fought for territory, they controlled something arguably more powerful: the flow of federal dollars. By mastering paperwork instead of weapons, they directed resources across multiple states with speed and precision. In traditional organized crime, gangs protect their business with violence. In this case, the network protected itself with bureaucracy, exploiting the speed of pandemic programs and the trust given to child nutrition sites. AP News noted that some locations claimed to serve more children than lived in the surrounding neighborhoods. Yet the numbers passed through unchecked because the paperwork appeared complete. The system itself shielded the fraud. What made this design especially dangerous was how well it deflected attention. A violent gang attracts police immediately. A paperwork-driven network, however, can operate for months or even years without drawing suspicion. The DOJ confirmed that the organization expanded rapidly during the pandemic because emergency rules loosened oversight, allowing the participants to submit claims with far less scrutiny than before. Instead of moving contraband, they moved forms. Instead of hiding drugs, they hid transactions. And because the work was divided among dozens of people, no single arrest could bring the entire operation down. Even when investigators finally connected the dots, they discovered that the network had already multiplied, creating layers of companies and individuals that could replace each other if one piece failed. This resilience is what separates ordinary fraud from organized crime. It is also the reason federal agents spent months quietly gathering documents, financial records, and location data before making a move. The structure gave the group time to grow, time to adapt, and time to push the boundaries far beyond what anyone expected. But if this network had no turf, no weapons, and no visible leadership, then how did it stay hidden for so long, right in the middle of American neighborhoods? And what allowed it to move millions of dollars without anyone noticing? When federal agents began pulling apart the layers of the scheme, they discovered that the real strength of the network was not in its size, but in how perfectly it blended into ordinary American life. Nothing about the surface looked criminal. In fact, it looked safe. Many of the organizations involved were registered as nonprofits, daycares, learning centers, or small grocery stores. According to the Star Tribune, several of them had state licenses, community partnerships, and long paper trails showing compliance with nutrition programs. Anyone passing by would have seen nothing more than a quiet building tucked into a Minneapolis neighborhood. This facade was the shield. Every application form, every contract, every invoice appeared complete. The paperwork matched what federal programs expected to see. A P-News later reported that some locations submitted lists claiming thousands of children receiving daily meals, and the documents were filled out with the kind of detail that would normally reassure auditors. That surface-level legitimacy allowed the fraud to grow undetected. The buildings looked open, the staff looked busy, the signatures looked real. Only when investigators stepped inside did the illusion fall apart. Fox 9 Minneapolis noted that agents found empty kitchens, storage rooms without food, and offices with no evidence of large-scale operations. Many sites had never served the number of meals they claimed on federal reports. Some had not served any meals at all. The reports were fabrications, designed specifically to match the flow of government dollars during the pandemic. The more convincing the report, the more money arrived. As federal financial analysts followed the oversight trail, a disturbing pattern emerged. Although the paperwork showed food purchases, the bank statements did not. The Department of Justice confirmed that millions were spent instead on luxury homes, high-end vehicles, personal travel, and international transfers. Money that was supposed to feed children was diverted into private accounts or routed through shell companies before leaving the country entirely. The funds moved quietly, carried by electronic transfers instead of couriers, and hidden behind explanations that seemed ordinary on the surface. This method of concealment worked because it targeted the weakest point in any emergency system: speed over scrutiny. During the pandemic, federal programs pushed money out quickly to prevent hunger, and the network used that pace to hide its activity. Since every document appeared legitimate at first glance, oversight became a race the government could not win. Crowded agencies processed thousands of applications, and fraudulent sites slipped through simply because they looked normal. There were no red flags, no reports of violence, and no suspicious crowds around the buildings. Everything was designed to disappear into the background. The sophistication of the deception helps explain why the scheme lasted so long. Each layer of the network supported the next. If one location was questioned, another could produce a fresh set of documents. If an auditor asked for numbers, paperwork appeared with thousands of names. The routine nature of the forms made the activity harder to detect, and the absence of traditional crime markers meant law enforcement had no reason to look closer. What finally forced federal agents to notice the cracks in the system? And why did it take so long for the truth to reach the surface? The turning point in this investigation did not begin with a dramatic raid or a tip from the street. It began with numbers. Deep inside federal spending databases, analysts noticed patterns that did not behave like normal relief operations. According to AP News, several Minnesota-based food sites were reporting meal counts so high that they exceeded the number of children in the surrounding neighborhoods. Some reported serving thousands of kids every single day, though despite having little space, few staff, and no visible food deliveries. At first, these oddities looked like data entry errors. But as the same names, same addresses, and same bank accounts kept reappearing across different applications, the abnormalities became impossible to dismiss. This was when federal agencies took notice. The FBI opened a financial probe, the IRS began tracing tax records, and the Department of Justice started comparing claims with on-the-ground evidence. Each agency brought a different skill set. Fox 9 Minneapolis reported that federal teams began mapping out the network on paper, drawing lines between individuals who insisted they were unrelated but shared business filings, property ownership, or sudden spikes in income. What looked like coincidence slowly transformed into a structure. Once investigators followed the money, the scale became undeniable. Bank activity revealed large federal deposits landing in accounts connected to nonprofits, daycare centers, and community programs. Yet almost immediately, the money moved elsewhere. Transfers went to personal checking accounts, luxury vehicle dealerships, and real estate companies. The Star Tribune confirmed that one suspected organizer purchased multiple high-end homes within months, funded entirely by child nutrition dollars. The speed of the cash flow was the biggest red flag. Legitimate programs spend steadily. Fraud spends immediately. As investigators expanded their scope, they began connecting the transactions to people who claimed no relationship with each other. Two defendants might list different businesses, different operational regions, and different meal sites, but their financial footprints overlapped. DOJ filings revealed repeated payments between shell companies, often in round numbers with no explanation. These movements suggested coordination rather than chance. And because the network operated without violence, it had left almost no trail for traditional criminal investigation. Everything had been hidden inside digital transfers, neatly typed invoices, and misleading receipts. What pushed the investigation into its next phase was the sudden realization that the fraud was not limited to a single operator or neighborhood. It stretched across cities, counties, and eventually multiple states. Federal agents began to understand that they were not dealing with one ambitious fraudster, but an organized network using the same playbook. That discovery forced the case into high priority. The DOJ authorized a full-scale task force, joining accountants, cyber analysts, and criminal investigators in a single operation. Once the structure appeared on paper, the investigation shifted from quiet observation to active tracking. Agents monitored new claims in real time. They watched bank activity with temporary warrants. They compared addresses, receipts, and digital signatures. Every day, more inconsistencies surfaced. It became clear that the network had been growing rapidly under the cover of pandemic urgency, exploiting the government's need to push aid quickly. This was the moment the investigation could no longer remain silent. The federal agencies had mapped the flow of money, identified the key players, and confirmed the scale of the operation. But once investigators finally uncovered the full map of the money flow, one question pushed everything into motion. How do you take down a network that never shows its face, yet moves millions in silence? And what happens the moment federal agents decide to strike all at once? When federal agents were finally ready to act, the shift from quiet surveillance to public confrontation happened almost instantly. At dawn, in coordinated operations across Minnesota and several neighboring states, indictments were unsealed, and dozens of suspects found themselves at the center of one of the largest fraud takedowns of the pandemic era. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, 47 defendants were charged in the first wave alone, all connected through a web of meal programs that had reported serving millions of non-existent lunches. This was not a single arrest or a slow drip of warrants. It was a synchronized move designed to prevent anyone from slipping away before investigators could secure the evidence. AP News confirmed that federal prosecutors aimed to strike hard and fast because they believed the network had the ability to shift money or contacts if given even a few hours warning. The charges painted the full scope of the operation: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and the misuse of federal child nutrition funds formed the backbone of the indictments. DOJ filings described shell companies that existed only on paper, bank accounts created to move federal money into private pockets, and false invoices that mimicked real food deliveries with almost cinematic precision. Each charge carried years of potential prison time, but more importantly, they revealed how deeply the network had embedded itself into public programs that were supposed to protect children during a national emergency. Once the arrests began, federal agents moved to freeze the flow of cash that had fueled the network. Bank accounts were locked, vehicles were seized, and luxury homes purchased with federal aid money were placed under government control. According to Fox 9 Minneapolis, investigators took possession of several multi-million-dollar properties, including newly built suburban homes and commercial buildings acquired during the height of the pandemic. The Star Tribune reported that agents found evidence of international wire transfers and withdrawals made just days before the arrests, strong indicators that some members of the network sensed the investigation closing in. Because of this, not everyone stayed put. AP News revealed that several defendants attempted to leave the country, and one was detained at an airport with luggage packed for a one-way flight. Others had already transferred money overseas, hoping it would be out of reach before federal warrants were issued. These escape attempts only strengthened the government's argument that the scheme was organized, strategic, and aware of the legal danger it faced. The rush to flee added urgency to the federal response and became a critical point in the government's public explanation of how the network operated. However, the consequences extended beyond the arrests themselves. As the indictments became national news, political debate erupted almost immediately. Lawmakers questioned how such a massive fraud could take place during a period when federal relief money was under intense scrutiny. Commentators raised concerns about gaps in oversight, especially for emergency programs that relied on trust and speed. The Star Tribune noted that the case sparked renewed discussions in Minnesota about nonprofit accountability and the vulnerabilities in public benefit systems. Meanwhile, national outlets pointed to the case as an example of how organized crime can evolve without weapons or territorial control, using paperwork and policy loopholes instead of violence. Thus, the impact on communities was equally significant. Some residents felt betrayed that organizations they trusted had been used for profit, while others worried that honest nonprofits might now face harsher inspections because of the scandal. This public reaction became part of the narrative, shaping how the case was perceived across the country. All of this formed the backdrop as federal prosecutors prepared for a legal battle that would stretch for months, ensuring that the network's collapse marked not just an end, but the beginning of a larger conversation about how modern crime hides in plain sight. The escalation of public scrutiny leads directly into the next question. What did this case reveal about the vulnerabilities inside federal aid systems? And how did it force Washington to reconsider the meaning of national security in a world where criminals no longer need weapons to cause damage? As the indictments spread across headlines, it became clear that this case was no longer just about one criminal network. It exposed weaknesses inside America's emergency aid system that few people had ever considered. During the pandemic, Congress authorized massive funding to prevent hunger, and agencies were told to move fast so children would not go without meals. That speed created gaps. According to AP News, federal auditors admitted that verification standards were loosened, making it easier for fraudulent claims to appear legitimate. What should have been a safety net became a wide-open gate, and this network walked straight through it. The political impact arrived almost immediately. Lawmakers in Minnesota and Washington demanded explanations for why state officials and federal agencies missed the warning signs. The Star Tribune reported heated debates in legislative hearings, where some argued that the case showed a failure of oversight, while others insisted the system had been overwhelmed by the sheer scale of pandemic needs. Immigration politics quickly entered the conversation. Although most defendants were charged because of fraud rather than immigration violations, the case reignited national arguments about screening, community oversight, and how federal money flows into organizations run by recent arrivals. Public reaction hardened as millions of dollars in stolen funds and luxury purchases created the impression of a system stretched beyond its limits. However, the most unsettling question came from investigators themselves. If one network could take more than $200 million without detection, how many others were operating quietly inside the United States? Fox 9 Minneapolis noted that federal agents expanded their review of meal programs statewide because the patterns in this case might match other suspicious claims. DOJ officials did not rule out additional indictments, and analysts warned that decentralized fraud networks often replicate their methods across multiple regions. The idea that this scheme might be only one example of a deeper national vulnerability captured public attention and fueled concern in Washington. At the same time, the FBI began re-examining how modern organized crime functions. The traditional image of criminal groups, territorial, violent, and visibly threatening, did not apply here. Instead, this network relied on paperwork, digital transfers, and bureaucratic knowledge. AP News observed that the case challenged long-standing assumptions by proving that organized crime no longer needs weapons or territorial control to cause enormous damage. It simply needs access to systems designed to trust the information they are given. This shift forced federal agencies to rethink how they define criminal organizations in an era where data and documents can replace force. The consequences extended beyond law enforcement. Nonprofits across Minnesota saw funding reviews tighten, and community groups unrelated to the case suddenly faced new reporting requirements. Some leaders argued these measures were necessary to rebuild trust. Others worried that legitimate organizations would now suffer because of a fraud they had no part in. That tension revealed how deeply the scandal affected public confidence. For everyday Americans, the case was a reminder that even programs built to help children could be manipulated if safeguards fail. As Washington processed the fallout, a sharper understanding began to form. The threats that make no sound can cause the greatest harm. This network, operating without force or confrontation, had taken advantage of a national crisis and funneled millions of federal dollars into private hands. Its impact traveled far beyond Minnesota, pushing its way into political hearings, policy arguments, and wider national security conversations, where officials were forced to confront how such a quiet operation managed to penetrate systems built for public protection. This shifting landscape leads directly to the final question of our investigation. What does the future look like for a country where crime no longer announces itself with danger, but hides inside the paperwork of ordinary life? In the end, the most striking part of this story is how quiet it was. No gunfire, no street battles, no dramatic escapes through dark alleys. Instead, the danger hid inside spreadsheets, signatures, and reports that looked harmless until investigators followed the numbers. AP News noted that more than $250 million disappeared before anyone realized how deep the cuts had become, a reminder that modern crime can do enormous damage without ever showing its face. Financial losses on this scale reshape communities, overwhelm relief programs, and force taxpayers to rebuild what criminals quietly dismantled. What this case exposed is a new battleground. The fight is no longer just about physical threats. It is about data trails, hidden transactions, and the patience required to identify patterns that do not belong. Federal agents did not win this case with force. They won it with weeks of analysis, thousands of documents, and a determination to understand how the network moved through the system without a sound. In many ways, this is the future of investigation. A slow, precise battle against criminals who rely on silence instead of fear. So the question now belongs to all of us. How many similar networks do you think are still operating quietly across the country? Subscribe to Military Power if you want to understand the threats that rarely make headlines and the hidden stories shaping the world around us.